All right, welcome everybody around the world. Welcome to all my subscribers. This will be a nice short video. I just have a small little lineup of verses to read, and I specifically have organized it like this with this selection of verses because you just need this little selection to prove something that's monumentally huge. Okay, although I could, like I've done in my systematic theology that's available on Amazon, gone through, over a span of 50 plus pages with dozens and dozens of verses to help prove this concept. This here is a little selection. So, as an expiatory Unitarian, one of the fundamental beliefs, which is the biblical truth, is that Jesus was not an atoning sacrifice. He wasn't a sacrifice whatsoever. And that actually the concept of him or anyone being a sacrifice, especially an atoning sacrifice, is the height of ignorance, arrogance, and abomination and heresy. Okay? Now, fortunately, the early Christian church did not believe Jesus was a sacrifice. This took over 600 years, up to 1,000 years after Jesus, for that concept of him being an atoning sacrifice to be established. Okay, when they started to have the first church councils where the heads from different regions would come together and they would debate over what church doctrine should be. This started in around the 400s, 500s, and 600s. But even by the 600s, the atonement sacrifice theory was not established Christian doctrine yet. Okay, and it was not concreted in until another 400 years, taking it to about 1000 AD. This is ridiculous. Okay, now, why is it important to understand that Jesus was not an atoning sacrifice? Even still being a Christian, you can be Christian without believing he was a sacrifice, right? But what's the importance of this? What are the implications? Well, quite simply, if Jesus was not a sacrifice, which is the biblical truth, then it could be the height of heresy to suggest that God would appoint what is none other than human sacrifice. Okay, I think what has been done by Satan is he has presented what is none other than a very satanic twist on biblical Christianity, and he has fed it to the churches, okay, for the last near 2,000 years, about 1,500 plus years. And he slowly diluted the churches. Okay, now unfortunately, it's become concreted in the average Christian. 99% of them believe Jesus was a sacrifice, and they think that I'm heretic for suggesting that he wasn't. Okay? But from this little lineup of verses here, we could see that there's absolutely no way possible that Jesus could have been a sacrifice. Why? Because God is against the concept of humans being sacrifices. Okay? This is not something that you can underestimate. This is something that he maps out and makes very clear in the following verses that I'm about to read. Okay, human sacrifice is an abomination. The very heathen peoples that used to inhabit the land of Israel before the Hebrews went over there after the Exodus with Moses and all of them to enter the promised land and all that, God was driving out all those hard nations. They were bad nations because they did abominations and wickedness such as human sacrifice. And God says that he's driving these nations out for their wickedness that they practiced, which included human sacrifice. We know that God has repeated throughout the Bible that he hates human sacrifice, and he destroyed nations who practiced human sacrifice. So why would God turn around and suddenly say, oh, well, I'm going to change my mind and institute human sacrifice? But not just any human sacrifice of his own child. Okay, so there's multiple layers of what is heretical blasphemy here in the Jesus sacrifice concept. But church Christians have been so deluded, I feel, by Satan and his works that they don't see this. Okay, they get guilt tripped into believing Jesus is the only way for their worthless sinning self to be forgivable. Okay, and when you're spoon-fed that concept that, oh, you're terrible, you're tarnished, we're all tarnished, none of us are worthy, none of us can be righteous. This is what they tell people, right? To ensnare them in. They say that the only way out, the only way that you can escape eternal torture in hell, which is another lie, all this stuff, they say the only way out is by Jesus' sacrifice, right? And he did it once and for all, but you have to believe in it and believe that he sacrificed, and that by his sacrifice all of your guilt is atoned and you can be found worthy and innocent. So what the churches have done is said that that is the only way you can get salvation, and you cannot get salvation without that. You have to believe that he was a sacrifice. Well, Jesus was a human. He wasn't a goat. Okay, he was a human. And if you want to say and categorize that Jesus was a sacrifice and make it the biggest, most fussed over detail in your theology, then what you're saying is that God is a hypocrite. Okay, and not only that, but that God is savage and barbaric. Now, I refuse to believe that God would ever appoint sacrifices, especially of innocent lives, animals, and especially of people, especially of children. Okay. And, the satanic level of heresy nestled into this church concept that they don't see is that you're not only saying that God has appointed human sacrifice, but you're saying of children, but of the firstborn child, which is even worse, right? You only get one firstborn child. And then after that, and those are supposed to be special to God. But not only that, but you're saying it was the child of God. So it was God's own child and God's own firstborn child. So it just gets worse and worse and worse. But it doesn't end there, because you're also saying that it was the Messiah. So not just God's child, but a very important figure for this earth, the Messiah. And then not just that, because most Christians believe Jesus was God. So they're saying that God himself was the sacrifice, which is a whole nother level and universe of blasphemy and abomination and ridiculousness. So there's like 7, 8, 9, or 10 layers of what is heretical belief nestled in and hidden away in that Jesus sacrifice theory. Okay. And they ensnare people by saying that you essentially are worthless as a sinner, and your only way out is to believe that Jesus died as a sacrifice for you, an atoning sacrifice. Okay. Now, an atoning sacrifice is the most sheepish type of sacrifice you could say in that concept, the way they present it, because you haven't done anything to earn release and being free from your guilt. You haven't done anything to earn forgiveness. You just believed because somebody told you, if you believe in this, all your guilt will get deleted. Just because you believe in that, you haven't done anything to deserve it. You know what I mean? So no matter how you look at the scenario, it just looks like a very narrow-minded, even narcissistic type of concept that people go along with because it suits them well inside. And they think that, oh, well, there's nothing I can do. Good works don't matter, and this and that there. I just got to believe in this sacrifice and all my guilt will be wiped away. This is a very, very dangerous concept. Okay. And what goes in hand with this, is that these churches who teach this, which is most of Christianity, because every denomination, except for expiatory Unitarianism, believes that Jesus was a sacrifice. Every denomination and sub-denomination does. There isn't one out there that doesn't. The ones back in the day, centuries ago and millennia ago, got rooted out by the other churches, and they got wiped away from existence. They don't really exist anymore. So, and they were heavily persecuted. So, very few people understand this truth. But let me shut up and let's go look at these verses very quickly here, right? So that was just some logic, but here's some verses here. But like I said, it's important to understand that that church concept that they use to ensnare is that they make you feel like you're worthless, dirty, and sin. I mean, you might be super guilty, don't get me wrong, but they make you feel like there's no way out of your inescapable due wrath because of your dirty sins. And they paint this tunnel that's the only way out, and that's through by believing Jesus was a blood sacrifice for your sins to wipe away your own guilt without you doing anything to deserve it. He just does it because you believe that he was a human sacrifice, right? So the mechanics of this, what it's actually doing is making the believer, it's compartmentalizing their brain. When you look at the raw facts, the way I just said it, it's showing you that it's making the believer in such a thing compartmentalize their brain and get narrowed in a corner, whereby the only way out from that situation is they feel, oh, Jesus has to be a sacrifice. They can't see another option because they've been cornered there through this dogma, right? But the reality is this: it is not true that you cannot be righteous. We have been commanded to be righteous. They always make it about word games. Being righteous means you're being a righteous person, you're not doing sin. But the church has put dogma in it, and they say that, oh, nobody can be righteous, none are righteous. And they'll pull out one or two verses that appear to say that, right? The point is, the overall common sense context is that we should stop doing what is bad. Reformation is commanded in order to be saved, but the churches don't even teach that. That's a whole nother topic. The point is, what we're supposed to do is very simple. We stop being a bad person. We spiritually, we put our old sinning self to death with Christ at our baptism of Reformation, and then we're reborn as a new creature in mind, spirit, and everything, reborn from above with a new way of thought and everything. That's what we're supposed to do. And if we do that, then we get forgiveness of sins. Now, all of this is very logical, meaning you stop being a bad person, you stop doing bad things, you become a new person who doesn't do bad things. You've actually done something to deserve being forgiven. Okay, you could even take it a step further and try to physically atone for certain things that you've done. You know what I mean? That's even better, right? But all of this is a logical system. The system that the churches have painted that, oh no, just believe Jesus was a human blood sacrifice and all your guilt be wiped away. You don't have to do anything else. You will begin to see that that is not only illogical, it is unbiblical, and it's very, very dangerous and destructive. And it's just a mental loop that's been created, psychological like handcuffs through this dogma, okay, to paralyze somebody in the corner and think that they're dirty rags, they can never be clean unless it's by the blood sacrifice of Jesus, right? Well, let's go start off with this great verse here that I found, Proverbs 17:15. So all these verses, I've only got about half a dozen verses, they're all going to highlight what God identifies as an abomination. That's the key thing here, right? So in Proverbs 17:15, it says, whoso is justifying the wicked and condemning the righteous, even both of these are an abomination to God. So we see here something very ironic. It says that it's abominable to justify people who are wicked and to condemn people who are righteous. But if you were to go to the churches today, okay, all of the churches, because they believe in the blood sacrifice of Jesus theory, no matter whatever else they believe might be super different from one another, it doesn't matter. They all believe that one thing, like an anchor of error. They would all tell you that, oh, no, none of us can be righteous. And if you ever try to claim, well, I'm being righteous, I stopped doing sins, they will tell you, oh, no, you're still dirty and your righteousness are dirty rags and filthy rags. They'll do everything to smear you and make you feel smeared. And like your only way out is this blood sacrifice again, right? So again, what they're doing is condemning the righteous. Because if you are being righteous, they will still tell you, no, you're unrighteous, and they will condemn you. They will even slander you, right? This is literally what they do. I've lived it. I've been a victim to it, right? This is how they operate because of the mental dogma, psychological, programming that they've gotten from their dogma over such a long time with church history, right? Now, the reality is that what these churches are also doing is that they're justifying the wicked. Now, only God is the judge, right? Now, if God did not appoint this magic blood sacrifice of Jesus, then there is no magic forgiveness of all your grievous sins just because you want it to be. It's up to God who is the judge, obviously. All of this is common sense. So if in reality, which I would say is the case, God didn't appoint a blood human sacrifice of Jesus, then nobody is just having all their sins atoned away like they never occurred because they believe in something that's not actually really in God's mind. They just think and want to think God has instituted this, and they're living their lives based around it. And because they're doing that, what they're doing is justifying wicked people, even of themselves. There'll be sinners who have done bad sins, who continue to do bad sins. They've not reformed yet. They're not taught to reform. They don't know that they have to reform, but they're out there doing sins, but declaring themselves innocent, righteous, and worthy of heaven. This is what all the churches have taught them to do. And all the people who actually are reforming and trying to be righteous get demonized and condemned by them. So if we go back to the verse here, it says, whoso is justifying the wicked and condemning the righteous, even both of these are an abomination to God. So I just find it ironic that God specified that this is an abomination to God. When you justify people who don't deserve to be justified, and when you're condemning people who don't deserve to be condemned. Okay? So, anyways, moving on. More importantly, these are the other verses that God highlights what he finds as an abomination. Now, in Revelation 21, verse 27, this is important to point out. And there may not at all enter into it, meaning the gates of the New Jerusalem, anything defiling and doing an abomination and a lie, but those written in the scroll of the life of the Lamb. So the point of this verse is to show that God doesn't let anything in to heaven which does abominations. Now, God might dislike certain sins and hate other sins, but some sins are abominable to him. He hates them. They're utter abominations. And if you do defiling things or abominable things, then you're not getting into heaven. That's the point of that verse. Right? Now, next, in Matthew 12, verse 7, it says, "And if ye had known what is," this is Jesus speaking, "kindness I will, and not sacrifice, ye had not condemned the blameless." And I find this so ironic because Jesus was being referred to here, right? Jesus was the blameless one who is still yet being condemned. Actually, I didn't even plan this. That goes right back to my first verse, Proverbs 17. It's an abomination to condemn the righteous and justify the wicked, right? And here's Jesus saying, "And if ye had known what is, kindness I will, and not sacrifice, and ye had not condemned the blameless." Right? So Jesus is pointing out that God didn't want sacrifice, right? If he doesn't want it, then he certainly wouldn't institute it. Okay? And Jesus is pointing out that we shouldn't have condemned the blameless, which was him. Okay? Now in Hebrews 10, verse 5, it says, "Wherefore coming into the world," again, this is being spoken about Jesus, "he saith, quote, sacrifice and offering thou, God, did not will, and a body thou dost prepare for me. Thou did prepare for me." So this verse is being spoken of as Jesus saying it, and Jesus is speaking to God and saying, "Sacrifice and offering you didn't want, oh God," and then says to God, "And a body you made for me." So if Jesus's body was meant to serve as this blood sacrifice, why would Jesus be saying this, right? But anyways, those are the minor points. These are the hard-hitting verses. There's 4 of these to read. So very first, in Deuteronomy 9:5, right? Like I said earlier, God wiped out the nations that practiced human sacrifice. Okay, God had laws against human sacrifice. Now in Deuteronomy 9:5, it says, this is when God was speaking to Israel and Moses and explained to them why he chose Israel, right? He says, "Not for thy righteousness, not for the uprightness of thy heart, art thou going in to possess their land," which is the promised land, "but for the wickedness of these nations is God thy God dispossessing them from before thee, and in order to establish the word which God had sworn to thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob." And it's stressed elsewhere that the sins that these nations did was human sacrifice, especially child sacrifice. In 2 Kings 16:3, it says, "And he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, and also his son he has caused to pass over into the fire, according to the abominations of the nations that God dispossessed from the presence of the sons of Israel." Okay? So those verses specify another thing that God finds as an abomination, and that is human sacrifice, right? And I just find it beautiful and poetic how just concentrating on these, rare, somewhat rarely occurring words, abomination, we find these connections to this one topic I'm talking about, Proverbs 17. If you justify the wicked, that's an abomination. If you condemn the righteous, that's an abomination. That does actually go right in hand with the concept of Jesus not being an atoning sacrifice. It goes 100% in all of this. So God has identified here that the abominations that the nations did was human sacrifice, child sacrifice. Okay, now, and this is why he dispossessed them from out of the land, the promised land, and enabled the people who would become Israel to come into that land. He did not bring in the Hebrews and all of them into the promised land because they deserved it. That's why he said, "Not for thy righteousness and not for thy uprightness of heart are thou going in to possess their land, but for the wickedness of these nations is God thy God dispossessing them, and in order to establish the word which God had sworn to thy fathers." Right? So the abominable practices of human sacrifice was the primary reason, one of the primary reasons why the promised land was emptied out. Those nations were destroyed by Israel and by God, and that the people of Israel got to go into the promised land to start with, okay, is because the sin of human sacrifice was that bad that it causes God to bring destruction upon a nation that does it. So next, these are the best verses here. In Jeremiah 19:5, it says, "And have built the high places of Baal to burn their sons with fire, burnt offerings to Baal, that I commanded not, nor spake of, nor did it come upon my heart." So this is God criticizing the people for doing human sacrifice, child sacrifice. And he says that he did not command it, nor spoke of it, nor did it come upon his heart to do such atrocities, right? In Jeremiah 32:35, "And they build the high places of Baal that are in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to cause their sons and their daughters to pass through to Molech, which I did not command them, nor did it come upon my heart to do this abomination, so as to cause Judah to sin." So you can see here that, again, clearly, God has classified human sacrifice as an abomination. Okay, it's common sense, really. It's not rocket science. Human sacrifice is savage, barbaric. It is not good. It is not righteous. It is not sensible. It doesn't achieve anything. A human blood sacrifice cannot wipe away your guilt. That is ridiculous. Okay, it's illogical. It's barbaric. But yet the churches all believe it. And why do they believe it? Because they've been dogmatically convinced to believe it over a very long time. When you look at the scripture, God says what he finds abominable. He says that human sacrifice is an abomination. Okay? And if God says that, and that he never gave commands to do it, such a thought never crossed his mind or heart, then why are you going to accuse God of being a hypocrite and say that, oh, no, he changed his mind and then appointed it of his own child or of his own self? This is the height of heresy and apostasy. Okay? So at the end of the day, I've been thinking to myself, well, what if the judgment day comes, right? Or, at the end of each person's own individual life, whichever comes first, and they're on their own individual judgment like that there, right? Which is the default for anybody anyways. Let's just say they go to be judged. Now, what if they were really good, righteous, upstanding people, but they believed that Jesus was a blood sacrifice? I'm not God, so I can't even say or call the shots to say what God would speak. I don't speak for God, right? But just using my own reasoning, I would say that if someone was really good, really righteous, but they believed something, dogmatically wrong, maybe God would be a bit more forgiving, right? So again, I don't call the shots. Only God can say how he decides in such matters. But it really starts to make you wonder, because it is a heresy to believe in human sacrifice. And to save another half-hour explanation, right, which I could easily get into, there is nowhere in the New Testament where it even says that Jesus is an atonement, because the word for atone doesn't even occur in the New Testament. In the original language, it's not even there. Atone, atoned, atoning, atonement. No form of the word atone occurs, period. The word propitiate or propitiation occurs 3 or 4 times. I think maybe just 3. And it's not even related. Like, propitiation has nothing to do with atonement. It's completely different. Right? They're somewhat related to each other, but they're completely different things. It's like apples and oranges and bananas are all fruit, but they look and taste very different, don't they? Right? You can't just say one thing which is not another thing that it is that thing in order to back your church dogma. But that's what they literally did. They altered Bibles. They took out the original terms in the Greek and in the Hebrew and put in their own corrupted versions. By doing that, they reinforced that Jesus was a sacrifice. But anyways, I prove it all in my systematic theology, right? But if you don't want to believe me, just use common sense, like I showed in this video. God says human sacrifice is an abomination. He didn't command it, never would. So why are the churches saying that he turned around and appointed it of his own son? Okay? Why would he? Why would he? They always say that, oh, well, what about Abraham and Isaac? Yeah, but at the end of the day, to start with, the simple explanation is God stopped him from doing it and said, don't do it. I don't want you to do it, right? That's the easy takeaway that everybody knows already, right? So God didn't command it and institute it for it to occur. He actually stopped it. Now, to bring it into a debate, I could point out that if you look at the root terms, considering the age of that story. It's very easy for like one letter, one dot to be changed, and then for the meaning to be lost. So the root of the word in Hebrew for sacrifice, to bind up Isaac and offer him up, is to do with going up, ascending. That's what the root of the word means. It means to go up. I think it's olam or olah or something like that, right? So a burnt offering, which is what was said about Isaac, means to go up. It means to send Isaac up. And we know that Enoch had already been taken up and ascended. There was a biblical precedent that very righteous people or special or important people could be taken up by God without dying. Okay, so my argument in defense of God is that God did not require and ask for a human sacrifice. Why would he? That would be ridiculous. He actually just told Abraham to go take Isaac up to be ascended. Okay, there you go. Look at the Hebrew word that's used. It means to go up, right? So it's a pretty good argument. And that would explain why Abraham told the other people who are with them, hey, wait for us. Me and Isaac will go up the mountain and we'll come back down together. So obviously, unless you want to say that Abraham was just lying to everybody and just doing all sorts of crazy stuff, human sacrifices and lying to people, unless you want to start smearing everything, then look at the more plausible reasoning, which is, no, he was just going to take Isaac, who is the special child, to go up there and be ascended up, right? Maybe he would see him again. Maybe he would disappear like Enoch, right? That's far different than tying him up, cutting him or whatever as some weird barbaric primitive sacrifice that doesn't achieve anything. Okay, so nobody can really pull out the story of Abraham and Isaac as a justification for why Jesus was a blood sacrifice. And plus, in the Abraham-Isaac story, there's nothing about atonement. It had nothing to do with that. Okay, God just came to Abraham and said, go up to Mount Moriah or wherever it was and cause Isaac to ascend up. That's all it was. Okay, and maybe Abraham took it the wrong way and got out the knife and the rope. Maybe he got out knife and rope just to make a little stand, right? I've argued that as well before. It doesn't necessarily mean that he was going to sacrifice his child, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because God stopped it and said, don't do that, right? So it's just highly preposterous to say that Jesus was a sacrifice. It's not taught in the New Testament. Nobody can atone for you. Psalm 49 says a brother cannot atone for you. The only way your sins can be forgiven, okay, is by you reforming. This is what the New Testament and the Old Testament teach. You have to reform, which means you stop doing the bad things, become a new person who doesn't do bad things. That's logical. That's simple, logical. That makes perfect sense. And that's biblical, okay? Believing in an ancient, heathen, highly abominable, sick, revolting, ridiculous, mindless, senseless concept of Jesus being a blood sacrifice is not achieving anything. Okay? It does not achieve anything spiritually. It's just accusing God of being a barbaric, warmongering human butcher. Okay? It's just very, very destructive. It's very illogical. So clearly, I think the resounding win here goes to expiatory Unitarianism because Jesus was not a sacrifice. You don't need Jesus to be a sacrifice to be forgiven. Why? Because Jesus himself and the New Testament says that the way you're forgiven is by reforming from sin. That's how you're forgiven. You don't need to have a blood sacrifice to be forgiven. You just need to stop doing what is bad to be forgiven. It's not rocket science. It's very simple, right? Very, very simple. Even the New Testament in Hebrews says that all of the sacrifices and the blood offerings didn't achieve anything. They were powerless. They had no force, power, or effect. They were fruitless. Okay? That's also pointed out theologically in the New Testament. And also, if you want to believe that Jesus was a sacrifice, well, the New Testament says and teaches in Hebrews that Jesus was the priest. Okay, and acted as the priest. He didn't exalt himself to be priest, it says, but he was dubbed as the priest and functioned as priest. Now, since when was the priest the sacrifice? The priest in the whole Bible, there's never been a time where the priest was a sacrifice. And Jesus specifically was supposed to be the acting priest at the time. Right? So logic, right? Logic. You can't be the sacrifice and be the priest who's doing the sacrifice. Okay, that is illogical. All right, and also Jesus was not the Passover sacrifice. Jesus himself did the Passover sacrifice with his apostles and disciples before he went on to die. Read the Bible. It's what it says. It's repeated in the Gospels. Okay, Jesus clarifies at times. He says, go get a lamb so we can have the Passover. Then he says, oh, we're all sitting down eating this Passover together. He announces and dictates what they're doing and makes it very clear that he partook in the actual Passover sacrifice before he went on to die. Okay, and plus the Passover sacrifice had nothing to do with sin or atonement, nothing whatsoever. Okay, the Passover sacrifice, it says in the Bible that God is saying to them that this will be your source of food for the Exodus, because you're about to get out of here the next morning suddenly, or during the night suddenly. You need to have all this food in you. That's why you need to do this. And the blood on the lintel, as weird as it is, was supposed to be the marker sign that the destroying angel wouldn't enter that house. Okay? Because the last plague, if I'm not mistaken, one of the last plagues on Egypt was that the firstborn were being destroyed, okay, of Egypt, because that's what they did to the Hebrews to mock them and everything. So during the Exodus, they're about to flee. So that's literally what the Passover was. It was a meal. You're meant, it says, eat it in haste because you're about to leave quickly. Do not eat it slowly. So that's what it was about. It was nothing to do with forgiveness or atonement. So saying that Jesus was the Passover lamb based on one verse that you get in the New Testament, no, that doesn't cut it. He wasn't the Passover sacrifice. He wasn't a sacrifice. Jesus himself said that God doesn't want sacrifice. Okay, it's very, very clear. And if he wasn't a sacrifice, how can you be saved? Well, quite easily. Read the Bible. It says, stop sinning, and then you'll be saved. Very simple. The Bible says sinners don't get into heaven. So stop sinning if you want to be saved. John taught that if you claim to know Jesus but keep doing sin, then you're a liar and you don't know God or Jesus. Right? There's abundant evidence I covered in my systematic theology. It's also in all my 200 plus videos. Okay, it's very, very clear. It's very, very simple. Okay, everybody in Christianity has been deceived, and the only true branch right now is the one that I'm heralding, expiatory Unitarianism. So I urge you all, go get my books. They're on Amazon. They're very, very cheap and affordable. Excellent, well worth the buy. $23, I think it is, $22.99 for my systematic theology, and it'll beat any 1,000 page boring systematic theology anytime. Right? Read one or two chapters, about 50 pages, something like that there. You will debunk not like 50% of Christian theology just with 50 pages right there. So, but I am a Christian, right? But I follow the true Christianity, what Jesus gave, what the Bible dictates. Okay? The true, logical, sensible, biblical Christianity, the one that will actually get you saved. Okay? So, anyways, thank you all for coming by. And well, thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, I thought it was the final plague. So, anyways, take care, folks. See you all later.